The sun hadn't yet risen over the snow-covered peaks of Montana's Bitterroot Valley when Thomas Cole was startled awake, not by his alarm, but by the sheer ferocity of the winter storm battering his cabin. The porch thermometer displayed a shocking 20 degrees below zero, a temperature that would have been extreme even by Montana standards. The landscape before him was frozen solid, each blade of grass encased in ice, transforming his familiar surroundings into an alien world of crystalline beauty and deadly cold. Thomas, a retired wildlife photographer who had spent decades capturing the raw beauty of the American wilderness, had witnessed his fair share of harsh winters, but even he shivered at the severity of this particular cold snap, which the local news had declared the worst in 50 years. While pouring himself a steaming cup of coffee, a blend from the small roastery in Hamilton he frequented each week, he glanced at the weather report on his tablet. The forecast was grim. Another 48 hours of sub-zero temperatures and heavy snow. The intense howling of the wind drew his attention to the large picture window, a feature he'd specifically requested when renovating the cabin 5 years ago after inheriting it from his father. The blizzard raged outside, whipping snow into blinding swirls that danced and twisted in the pre-dawn darkness. The scene reminded him of the photographs he'd taken during his last assignment before retirement, a series on winter wildlife survival for National Geographic. Suddenly, Thomas gasped, nearly dropping his favorite ceramic mug, a gift from his late wife, Sarah, who had always supported his dangerous profession. A massive grizzly bear was pressed against his window frame, her thick fur matted with ice that glistened in the dim morning light. What truly stunned Thomas wasn't just the bear's presence. He'd photographed hundreds during his career, but her behavior. She wasn't displaying any aggression. Instead, she was deliberately tapping on the glass with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a powerful creature. Peering closer through the frost caused by her breath, Thomas spotted 3 tiny cubs huddled behind her, shivering violently in the snow. His photographer's eye immediately noticed something was wrong with the smallest cub. Its movements were becoming increasingly uncoordinated. As he watched, the tiny creature suddenly collapsed, its body convulsing weakly against the frozen ground. The mother bear's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. She gently nudged the collapsed cub towards the window, pressing it softly against the pane. Her gaze locked with Thomas's in what could only be described as a desperate, silent plea for help. The wind hammered against the cabin's sturdy logs, underscoring the dire situation facing the bear family. Thomas's heart pounded as his mind raced through everything he knew about grizzly behavior from his decades in the field. He'd never witnessed such intelligent, communicative behavior from a wild animal. This was an undeniable request for sanctuary. The mother bear then lifted her massive front paws against the window, almost like a gesture of supplication, her eyes fixed on Thomas with profound urgency. In that moment, memories flooded back. Sarah's voice during their last conversation before her passing 2 years ago, reminding him to keep his heart open to life's unexpected moments. "Sometimes, Tom," she had said, "the greatest acts of courage are simply acts of kindness." The mother bear's eyes seemed to echo Sarah's wisdom, challenging him to set aside his fears and respond to this extraordinary plea for help. His decision could mean life or death for these cubs. Trembling slightly, driven by a mixture of compassion and the strange certainty that he was doing the right thing, Thomas moved to the heavy oak door. He remembered Sarah's favorite quote from their shared copy of Thoreau's Walden. "Could a greater miracle take place than for us to look through each other's eyes for an instant?" Perhaps this was such a moment. As he cracked open the door, the mother bear demonstrated an understanding that left him awestruck. She carefully nudged her weakest cub just inside the threshold before stepping back slightly, awaiting his acceptance. The warmth of the cabin seemed to revive the small cub somewhat. It let out a faint groan that tugged at Thomas's heart. The mother bear then gestured with her head towards the other two shivering cubs, her gaze returning to Thomas, full of pleading hope. Thomas understood completely. He opened the door wider, allowing the mother bear to gently guide all three cubs into the warmth. He watched her closely, but sensed no aggression, only an overwhelming maternal concern that transcended species. Once her young were safely inside, the mother bear entered with a grace that belied her size, pausing to carefully shake the ice and snow from her paws and fur by the doorway. This gesture of respect amazed Thomas, reminding him of the countless times he'd observed bears' intelligence through his camera lens. The bear family settled into a corner near his river rock fireplace, where a fire had been burning all night. Thomas couldn't help but notice how the mother kept her cubs close, occasionally touching each one with her nose, as if conducting a silent roll call. She was incredibly gentle, even using her snout to carefully rearrange a thick wool blanket Thomas had offered them, a gesture that demonstrated remarkable awareness and consideration. As the storm continued to rage outside, Thomas found himself thinking about his own family. His daughter Rachel, living in Seattle with her husband, had been urging him to sell the cabin and move closer to them. "It's not good for you to be so isolated, Dad," she'd say during their weekly video calls. But Thomas had always felt a deep connection to this wild place, and now, watching this extraordinary scene unfold in his living room, he understood why he'd needed to stay. Hour by hour, as the cubs regained their strength, Thomas observed their family dynamics with the same careful attention he'd once given to his photography subjects. The smallest cub, whom he'd mentally named Hope, stayed closest to its mother, while the other two, slightly larger and more curious, would occasionally venture a few feet away to explore their temporary shelter. The mother bear's patience with her cubs reminded Thomas of Sarah's gentle way with Rachel when she was young. He made several calls to the local wildlife authorities, but the storm had knocked out most services in the area. Besides, he realized any attempt to rescue the bears would likely cause more harm than good. They didn't need rescue. They needed exactly what they had found: temporary shelter from the deadly cold. The mother bear's behavior continued to amaze him. When one of the cubs started pawing at a shelf of books, she immediately called it back with a soft grunt. When another began exploring too close to the kitchen, she shepherded it back to their corner with gentle nudges. Thomas found himself wondering about the circumstances that had brought them to his window. Had they been driven from their den by the extreme cold? Had the storm caught them between seasonal feeding grounds? As the hours passed, Thomas sat in his favorite armchair, alternating between reading and observing his unusual guests. Occasionally, the mother bear would meet his gaze, and in those moments, he felt a profound connection, a bridge across the vast divide between their species. He thought about all the times he'd photographed bears in the wild, always maintaining a respectful distance. Now, sharing his home with these magnificent creatures, he was experiencing something far more intimate than any photograph could capture. The storm began to subside as evening approached, and Thomas noticed a shift in the mother bear's behavior. She rose quietly, stretching her massive frame, and began gently nudging her cubs. They responded immediately, understanding it was time to leave. The family moved towards the door with remarkable coordination, and Thomas noted how carefully each one, even the mother, stepped over the threshold, seeming mindful of his home. Before stepping out completely, the mother bear turned back to Thomas. She paused, looked directly at him, and in a moment he would never forget, briefly rested her massive paw on his arm. Her eyes conveyed a depth of understanding and gratitude that needed no words. Then, as quietly as they had arrived, the bears vanished into the snowy landscape, leaving only their tracks as evidence of their extraordinary visit. Thomas stood in the doorway watching until they disappeared into the gathering dusk. That evening, he called Rachel and told her about his experience. To his surprise, she didn't express fear or disbelief, but instead listened intently. When he finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "You know, Dad," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "Mom always said you had a special way with animals. I think she would have loved this story." In the years that followed, Thomas often thought about that remarkable day. He never saw that particular bear family again, though he occasionally spotted grisly tracks near his cabin during winter storms. The experience changed him in subtle but significant ways. He began volunteering at the local wildlife education center, sharing his photography and stories with visitors. His presentations always ended with a gentle reminder that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from moments when we set aside our fears and open our doors to unexpected guests. Each winter, when the first heavy snow falls, Thomas makes sure to keep his fire burning bright and his door ready to open, just in case. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind howls around his cabin's corners, he remembers the profound trust of that mother bear and the lesson she taught him about the deep bonds possible between all living creatures. Sarah had been right. The greatest acts of courage are simply acts of kindness. In choosing to help that bear family, Thomas had not only saved their lives, but had also discovered a deeper truth about his own humanity. In the end, it wasn't just the bears who had found shelter from the storm. Thomas, too, had found a new kind of warmth, one that continued to glow in his heart long after that extraordinary winter's day.